Hello, everybody, and welcome to another webinar here up at the TVC, the Technology and Venture Commercialization, up at the University of Utah. As usual, we're here with Phil Case, partner and managing director of Fluid Advertising. We also have Bryce Ott, the CTO of Modular Learning. Bryce, do you want to introduce yourself? This is the first time on this series.
Yeah, so I've been involved in the entrepreneurial startup world for quite a few years now. Most roles in the technology space, from development on up through CTO. And currently, Modular Learning is a technology education startup. Our customers are in higher education, and we provide a platform to improve student outcomes in difficult subjects.
Fantastic. Thanks for being with us, Bryce.
Yeah, great to be here.
We also have Spencer Walker, as well as Taylor Bench, representing the Technology and Venture Commercialization. Would you guys like to introduce yourselves as well?
Sure. Thanks, Dustin. Spencer Walker, manager on the Economic Development team, and also manage the Software Development Center. And Taylor?
Yeah, director of the Economic Development team here, and looking forward to talking about the company that Bryce is with, Modra. They're actually one of the licensees of a technology that came out of the university, so we'll be using their company as a case study today.
Fantastic. And then my name is Dustin Cederholm. I'll be your moderator, but mostly sharing the floor with the panelists here. The only person I didn't have introduced, Phil, do you want to just say a couple words about yourself?
No, great to be here. We've Dustin and I have done many webinars together, and we're excited to have the third in our series with Taylor and Spencer, talking about how to, go from kind of concept to product and now product to customer.
Fantastic. As usual, just a little housekeeping. You can find us on Twitter at #FluidWebinarSeries. We'll be live tweeting to that throughout the webinar, and you can ask any questions, and we'll try to respond to you there. You can direct message us at GetFluid, and you can direct message the TVC at TechComOff. One thing to note is as we go into the Q&A at the end of this, we will be going live on Facebook as usual. We'll drop that link into the comments bar. So for any of you who want to see these guys and the panelists answer your questions live, you can switch over to that platform, and we'll make sure we note that in the comments again. So without that, we will get into the third part of our four-part series.
So today we're going to go and look at product to first customer. As you recall, if you were on the last webinar, we talked about concept to product and how do we vet an idea and how do we vet a team that can take that idea forward. So today we'll spend some time talking about to first customer, and I guess what we'd like to have as a takeaway today would be where do you find those customers, how do you interact with them, what kind of feedback are you getting from them to help develop your product further, and then how do you use them in a good way, how do you use them to find more customers. As We've talked about the business model canvas, I think, in all of the webinars so far, and this is kind of a screenshot. We haven't shown the canvas quite like this before, but the canvas really should be used multiple times. It could be daily or weekly, and we've talked about the right side of the canvas, and that right side is where we'll really continue to be even today, and that is it's customer facing, and it's tying a direct value proposition to a pain that a customer and customer segment might have. And this is just an example of someone who is on probably third or fourth iteration of the canvas, and you can see sticky notes are a nice way to be able to do that. And the idea is that there's continual learning that happens throughout this, and we use the canvas in our office extensively.
I just had one question, maybe while you're on that point, Spencer, and while we have Bryce here. Bryce, just as an anecdotal example, how many times do you think you've pivoted through your business model since you initially started the development of the technology on Madra to where you are now and after you got your first customer?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say product-wise, probably at least half a dozen times. Some of those may have been minor pivots. But one of the things I love about the business model canvas is it really helps address upfront and early on a lot of the business-related pivots and investigation that you need to do, not just to develop a product, but really what's more important is to get people to buy that product and acquire those customers. And I would say at least a dozen other times we've pivoted on various aspects of the business because of investigation that we've done through the business model canvas and interactions with customers and interviewees.
Cool. That's good to know. I'll follow up with a more in-depth question after you've explained a little bit more about your business as to what the most impactful pivots are, but that's good to understand.
We, through the last couple of webinars, have also introduced a couple of resources and books that might be helpful. One that we thought we'd introduce here is Crossing the Chasm, Jeffrey Moore. Taylor, you probably had the most experience looking at this slide, at this slide.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting just to see how spot on the analysis of Crossing the Chasm is in terms of where the companies falter that we have spun out of the university. Over the last 10 years, we've spun out probably 150 or so new startup companies, and I think each one of them, the vast majority of them, would be just a perfect case study to overlay on this graph as to the development cycle of a company. So just understanding who your first 1 to 5 customers are in that innovator section and being able to then convert into the early adopters section, it's a slog and it is difficult. And even then, that's when you jump in and see the chasm there in the graphic. That's a lot of companies are dying there, and we see that in spades across the country in terms of just the typical startup company. And what we're trying to do at TBC is allocate enough resources and infrastructure to the companies coming out of our office and the technologies developed here, such that one of the people that we've worked with has used the phrase, we'll take the chasm out and maybe just create a gully of inconvenience rather than the chasm. But I mean, those are things that we are really focused on here in the office to avoid the falling into the chasm of our startup companies. So Bryce, I think, is a great example of where they are. I would probably say, and I won't steal your thunder, Bryce, but you're in that innovators, early adopters section where you have a few customers, you're generating revenue, and you're looking at that steep incline of trying to get to scale. So hopefully we'll talk about that today.
When did this book come out?
It was like 20 years ago, 15?
Yeah, because it's on the 3rd edition right now.
Yeah. It's fairly seasoned, and I think one of the most interesting things about that is that particularly with the increase in connectivity that we've seen in the world today, I think it's actually easier now than it was when this book was written to vet that initial phase, if you do it in a smart way. There's a lot that can be leveraged with technology and with early interactions with customers that I think 20 years ago were much more difficult to do. So they're still definitely there, but like you said, I think it's not unreasonable in most industries to try and treat that like a gully of inconvenience if you do it savvily.
Yeah, one of the things that was really interesting for us at the TBC, we actually put on about 6 times a year, we put on an event called Tech Tuesday, and we have a speaker come in. Last year, we had one of the co-authors of the book that is at what they call the Chasm Institute now, I think, come in and be a speaker at one of the Tech Tuesday events, and it was just fascinating to hear the research that went into this and the work that they've done and and the validation that they see every day at the Chasm Institute. It was just very fascinating to hear it from those who have written the book. So very interesting.
Taylor and I were talking today about where to find that first customer. I mean, so innovators and early adopters, those are groups of people. But and Phil, you talked, I think, in our first webinar about a little bit about archetypes of customers. But once we've identified, you know, the archetype, where do we actually find those people? And I think really you're looking for anybody that has a pain that your product addresses directly, and that first group of people is probably you know, friends of friends, business connections, people that you maybe have a certain level of trust with, that they've seen your work in the past. And something that someone told me a while back that stuck with me is to never eat alone. Just this idea of every day.
Wish I knew that in high school.
Never eat alone. There's protection in numbers. But the idea of, you know, that hour during the day is valuable time to continue to vet your idea and to try and you know, just test a marketing message on someone, and you know, maybe they feel obligated because you bought them lunch.
So Taylor and Spencer recently turned over one of their kind of spin-outs in the RV destination space, and I had a very fun meeting with them. And the audience was so interesting because they have a proof of concept, they have some customers, but you know, their comments to me, well, how do we go get more customers? And the process was, well, where do you find these people? You know, and it was so, I mean, one of the big ideas that came out of that was not only the RV shows, but why aren't you camping out at every RV dealership and rental facility? And why aren't you becoming best friends with them and having all of your materials strewn about? And they said, wow, we need to go spend more time there, don't we? And I said, I wouldn't pay any money, I wouldn't spend any money on paid advertising until you figure this out, and then come talk to us, because then it makes sense to go beyond those first customer sets, you know, but go get all the easy ones.
Yeah.
You know, and figure out where these people congregate, and it's different for every company and product, but usually, you know, there's enough of an economy built out that you can find them. Whereas it's the right shows, it's at the right, you know, meeting locations. You know, if you're trying to meet your Pokemon Go people, you know, you're going to go to the gyms and work out with them, right? So go where the people are, and that's really the first message, and we'll talk about this, but beyond friends and family, where does your audience congregate, you know, either virtually or physically? So
I think on that note, just being able to have multiple avenues. So that's what Spencer's put together here on the left side, and we talked about the people in pain this morning, and that's a lot of what the Crossing the Chasm talks about. Those innovators, they are in such pain to solve a problem that they're willing to take a minimum viable product and start using it because it solves exactly what it solves their problem. It may only get them 80% of the way there, but they're willing, because they're in so much pain, to use something that isn't quite finished or isn't quite complete. It's not a whole product. But those are your innovators in terms of that Crossing the Chasm graph that we looked at before. And if you can get 5 of them, that's where you're going to start getting a lot of your input for further development. And maybe Bryce can touch on that in terms of what he's seen in his company.
So let's say you can't find the perfect fit for that first customer, and you're going to your mom or your brother-in-law or your sister or someone that's very personally close to you. How do you tell whether or not they're giving you real feedback, or whether it's just what I kind of like to call the mom syndrome, where every mother thinks their child is beautiful, but they're not all going to win the baby pageant? How do you tell? I've actually thought about this a lot as we have gone out and pushed Madra with customers. How do you sift the real feedback from the not so valuable feedback?
I think that's a good question. I think sometimes you'll go to, like, it's a new company, you'll go to their website and you'll see some testimonials and you think this must have been written by their mom, right? Because it's so glowing and they don't even really have a product yet.
Now, I can tell you from experience, having done this a lot of times, that you will almost never find the perfect first customer. Usually you're going to find, because you haven't figured out necessarily what your product needs to do to land that perfect customer.
I don't think you really know your first perfect customer until you're out of friends and family. And you get a real person that's somewhat unconnected to you, that can give you real feedback and it can be candid. I mean, I think that's an important kind of threshold to cross.
Yeah. I would throw out there too that the best, in my experience, the best criteria in determining real customer from not real customer is in the definition of that. Of actually paying you something.
Oh, there you go.
If you can take someone's money, they're invested in some sense in what you're doing. Even if you have to get creative in that, maybe you don't have a full product yet, and you're selling them as more of a service, where you say, hey, we'll build these features that you want. We'll work on getting these things that are important to you if you'll give us something up front. But as soon as someone opens their wallet, you know they're invested on some level. So to me, that's.
Can you dive a little bit deeper into that, Bryce? Can you maybe share an experience or tell us in some of the companies that you've started, how do you rationalize saying, okay, I think I give $10,000 worth of value with my product, but my first customers, they probably won't pay that much. So then you say, okay, I'm going to discount my price, or what is it that you do to get them to pull the money out while not causing a problem down the road when you want to start charging the full price, or you want to start doing what you intended to do, but you have these initial customers that aren't fitting into your business model? What is it that you do to get those customers, and then how do you make it so they're not breaking your model?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think up front, you spoke a minute ago when we were talking about the chasm to the slog, that is those first stages, the innovators and those early adopters. And it really is. I don't think I can emphasize enough how difficult it can be to get through those first stages. Madra, we just had our 2-year anniversary. We spent probably 8 months to a year before we officially launched the company working on the concept and the product. And it feels like it's flown by, but I look at where we're at now, and it's certainly not where my wildest dreams had hoped we would be after 2 years. But it's a slog. You have to fight through that sometimes. There are companies that have just the gold product that oftentimes can jump into the market and get traction very quickly. Most of them, 99.9%, are not like that. And so, to answer your question, how do you get those customers without, I guess, tainting future relationships? I think you just have to weigh that and be upfront. We try to be very upfront as I've worked with other people and say, look, here's where we're at. Here's the problem we think you have that you've expressed to us. Is that a big enough problem that you're willing to help us work towards the solution by helping us fund it up front? And sometimes they'll say no, sometimes they won't because it's a big enough problem. I think you just have to be brave and get out there and recognize that. And as things change, there may reach a point where you have to let those customers go, or they no longer fit within the model. But I think that'll happen naturally, in my experience. If you move away from what they really need, then they'll find a better solution anyways. And initially, I think you just have to go after what money you can get that'll help move you in the direction that you need to go.
I like that. I think you mentioned something, that you sometimes have to let the customer go. And this funny little slide kind of shows aligning, your business goals and the goals of the customer. And hopefully at some point you can align those, but if you can't, maybe that's not the right customer for you, right? I mean, maybe it's time to stop investing in that relationship.
Yeah. And let me speak briefly to maybe some ways that you can get creative about that. I work with technology companies primarily, and it's mostly software. And we will very often initially, we may not have a fully baked product yet, but we will initially engage in more of a service-based relationship. Or in fact, that's how Madra was born. We started doing development work for someone here at the university that was building I would call it a product internally, but for their own use within their department. And we just did service-based work. We charged them for software development work. That evolved into a product that we then took and licensed, but we continued that relationship as long as it made sense. Basically with the premise that, hey, you know, whatever funding you guys can give us to continue development, that's going back into the product that's going to benefit you. And I think we'll talk a little more in a minute about how that business model evolved for us. But we don't do much of that anymore right now. But that was a great way for us to get some revenue in the door initially and engage with some customers initially that have been, frankly, invaluable to us as a company in our product.
So kind of as a segue into the case study on Madra, I found this interesting quote from the Prince, Machiavelli's The Prince, and I kind of tweaked it a little bit. He was talking about conquering other countries and going in and invading them, and then what you need to do to maintain the territory that you've invaded. So I'll read this, and I'm gonna tweak it a little bit as it relates to customer acquisition. But he says, when customers are acquired, there are problems. Great fortune and great abilities are required in order to keep such customers. One of the best and most efficacious solutions would be for those who acquire them to go and live there. This would make their possession more secure and lasting. The reason is that when one is there, one sees troubles as they arise and can deal with them immediately. When one is not there, one hears about them when they are full grown and there's no longer any remedy. Any potential competitor will think twice, for he who lives there can only be dislodged with extreme difficulty. And kind of would like to use that as a segue into talking about Madra. Bryce, can you tell us kind of where that came from and maybe just walk us through to where you're at today?
Yeah, so I mentioned a little bit, we were kind of born out of the genesis of some technology, some software that was developed at the university here, was built with a very talented and faculty member here that's been doing educational improvement type of stuff for the last 30 years. And he had done some of the stuff that we've employed in the software he'd done in the past with other systems. And when he came to us initially on sort of a contract arrangement, he really was interested in building a more stable platform for that he could use within his own classroom, within his own department. We very quickly saw the opportunity for that to be much bigger, that there's a much bigger market for that. And so we worked very closely with him in those initial requirements, and we had worked to mold those into something that's able to address a much bigger market. That's maybe another interesting comment about first customers is you will probably find that the first people to use your product are going to be the most vocal about what it should and shouldn't do, and that may or may not match what the rest of the market will say about it as a majority. And so you really need to take that feedback and figure out if it resonates with other users, with other potential customers. Because if it doesn't, you may end up building something that's great for a few people, but that the market as a whole is not going to be that interested in. And we certainly have had some of that with our initial customers. You know, the motivations for them were a little bit more localized than what we envisioned for the product, and we found that we still, in order to keep them as customers, had to continue to address some of those needs, but it was necessary for us to allocate resources in sort of bigger picture type of things. So,
can you tell us what it is? What is Madra?
Yeah, that's probably a good thing to share with you.
Right there.
So Madra, I think you have a couple slides here with some screenshots, but our objective is to help students improve their outcome, particularly in more difficult subjects. So here's a quick screenshot of this. Really the bread and butter of that is that we have a platform that's geared toward administering assessments. So that could be exams, quizzes, homework, any of those type of things. We then take the data that we gather from those assessments and we use some analytics to help improve the outcome of those, help improve both what students study and what instructors teach.
One of the other really innovative things that we do is we have some mechanisms within the platform to basically remove students, the technical term is their cognitive dissonance, but it's basically their overconfidence. So I may come in as a student and maybe I'm taking an introductory chemistry course, and in high school I aced chemistry, but that was at a 1A school or it was with an instructor that wasn't very aggressive, and now I'm in college and I think I'm going to do the same thing. Well, through our system, very quickly we help students realize where they're actually at within the course and what they need to do to improve their outcome. If they want to get an A, then we help them understand what they need to do that based on where they're at in an ongoing fashion. So our primary customer is we typically sell to instructors. We do that because we found, this is an interesting place where we pivoted based on our feedback from the Business Model Canvas. So we initially went into it thinking, hey, this is great, we're going to go and we're going to sell to departments, we're going to sell to K through 12, primary education, and they're going to love us. And because we can improve outcomes, we can show demonstrable improvement in what students are doing in the classroom, which, as if you've ever looked at education, that's really a hot topic right now. What we found, however, was that there was a lot of, as you might expect, a lot of red tape in that industry. Selling to K through 12, you're typically having to go to talk to superintendents or school districts. There's a lot of red tape, a lot of budget process. RFPs that go through that. Kind of some of the same thing within the university setting, within departments. What we found, however, is that as we talked to instructors, they really just wanted to try it out. They really were just looking, all the time we're looking for tools that would help improve their classroom. So instead of talking to administration, we started talking more to instructors. And we found that those were actually typically our users anyways. They were the ones that had to leverage the benefits of our system. And what we found as we talked to them was that the business model that worked best for them was not that we go and try to sell to their department, because then they'd have to go and requisition funds and go through budgeting, but rather it was that we took the same approach as if it was a textbook or another course material, where we said, hey, we're going to decide to use this as an instructor, and the students will go and pay for it, and they'll pay for it directly. Beautiful model. That completely changed the way that we approach sales, the way that we approach marketing, in a good way. Very different from what we initially expected when we went in and started investigating the market. It's worked great. The downsides of that are it's, funding is a little bit different. It's a little bit more cyclical. We don't typically get that. We typically get that when the semester begins and students pay for it. But the resistance from adoption is way lower than it would be if we went and sold to those departments. So that's where we've focused initially our efforts in pushing forward. There's a good chance that may change as we talk to people and as we grow, but that's been a great pivot for us on that front.
How hard was it to go from, so this was a technology that spun out of the U. Is the U a customer?
The U is a customer, yeah. In fact, they're still our largest customer.
That's good to hear.
Yes, it's worked well at home. So the chemistry department here at the university uses us for all of their assessment stuff. Kind of along the same vein of that business model change was also our value proposition changed a bit, because we found that there's still a lot of instructors that they use Scantrons. They don't care about digital assessments really. And initially our focus was, because we needed that data from the assessments, we really kind of branded ourselves as an assessment company. Well, there's a fair amount of competition there, and in fact there's several companies that do assessments better than we do because they've been doing it longer, and they're more to scale. But they don't offer the same value proposition where our real goal is to improve the outcomes. And so we found that what resonated with these instructors was not, hey, I can make you giving your exams and your quizzes easier, because they already were easy enough for them. What resonated with them was hey, we have a solution that'll improve your outcomes, and it's more content-based. So a lot of them, they were charging their students were paying for homework systems that would accompany their textbooks. We found that if we came in with the message of, hey, we can replace your homework system with something better, or we can augment it with something better that will help you leverage that content for better outcomes. That's where it started to resonate, and that's fit well with what I described in the business model of it being like a textbook. In the hard sciences, we found in the market that people are used to that. They're used to that model where they buy a homework system for their students. So I think until you get out and you really start to talk to people, your ideas of what may work are probably going to be very different from what actually does. But until you get out in the market and find that out, it's anybody's guess.
Tell us more about what that means. What did you have to do? What activities did you do to make that pivot such that your value proposition now was purchasable by your customers? Like what activities did you do to find that out?
To find it out, the most important activity was we just started talking to people. So we went through and found a list of chemistry instructors. We started close to home, locally, said what are all the universities. I don't know if I mentioned that our initial niche is in chemistry, general chemistry. So we said, what are all the universities here within the state that teach general chemistry? Let's go talk to them. We sent out just some cold calls and some emails and said, hey, we have a technology that came out of the university here, and we'd like to get your feedback on it. We just asked some questions and listened. We said, what makes sense from a value standpoint? Is there anything here that would be of value to you in your classroom? Do you care about improving outcomes? What type of students do you have? Are they overconfident? Are they struggling in certain things? Do you know what they're struggling in? When during the semester do you figure out kind of that breakdown of which students are likely going to fail, which aren't? And we found that there were a lot of ways that we could improve those outcomes for people. We also asked them, how do you find products that improve for you in the classroom? I'd say that's one of the other hugely beneficial things we found of talking to people is they were very open with us about the competition, about what the competition was doing and what they liked and didn't like about it. Hugely beneficial to our business model because we were able to see why they didn't like or why they did like other products that would compete with us. And I don't know that all industries are going to be the same as education. But in education, there's a high level of altruism, I guess. They really want, most instructors really want their students to learn. They want those outcomes to be better. And so they were very open with us and saying, hey, we don't like product X because it does this. It doesn't serve our needs.
Did you get any false signals from the market as you were building that product?
I'm sure we did. In fact, I'm trying to think what specifically there were. So one of the things that initially we thought would be good around the model was if we could leverage the instructors for getting the content or some of the content, almost like a crowdsourcing, that there would be some incentive for them to want, or we could incentivize them further by giving them some type of kickback or motivation or free service in the product. So we kind of started building this idea and this model around how we could offer commissions or some other type of kickback to the instructors. What we found as we started to go out and try and do that is there was almost an abhorrence to that. That it was like a big conflict of interest / they didn't want to touch that because they viewed it as something negative within the industry. And so we stepped back from that and said, okay, what motivates them to add content? Well, we didn't really have to do a lot. They were already motivated by seeing the outcomes. So that changed our model quite a bit, and we had to be very careful to quickly change the way that we talked about that, because it was almost like people didn't want to talk to us when we suggested that we might compensate them in some way, even if it was with additional free services or something like that. It just didn't resonate in that market, which was surprising to me.
I think these are great lessons learned, and it's more real, right, when it comes from someone who's actually, I mean, this isn't theory, we're talking about an actual company. So thanks, Bryce.
Yeah. You just have to get out there and talk to people. I think that's really the only way to slog through that.
How do people find out more about Madra?
You can visit our website. It's madralearning.com. I don't know if you guys publish these slides, but my email's also in there, bryce@madralearning.com. I'm very happy to answer any questions. If anyone would like to follow up with me, just reach out.
And we'll include this whole recording on the website, and we'll send it out in a recap email for all the registrants as well. So we'll include Bryce's information in that as well.
So we want to take a few minutes and just quickly be sensitive to finishing the webinar, but wanted just to touch on how do you actually build a brand, how do you build a story, and so talking about going to first customers, we want to talk about kind of the softer side, not the programming functionality, but how do you make it sound good and spin in such a way that people begin to respond and say, oh yeah, that sounds like what I need. And so you'll find that with Fluid, we're not the hardcore feature benefit developers and do the functionality, but when it comes to gaining actual customers that will pay you, that you can sell, that's kind of the secret sauce we want to walk through for a moment. So with that, as we talk about building a brand, I love this quote that today's consumer, they have an abundance of choice, and yet they yearn for experiences. They're not just attracted to products, but they're attracted to a narrative. And so it's incumbent on any rapidly growing business to have a story. Some of the best pitches I've heard in fundraising efforts are those that begin not with pie graphs and charts and numbers and data, but say, let me tell you a story and why I got into this. I think that far more emotionally connects with people. And when you can't do that face-to-face when you're acquiring customers, you got to make sure that your story is told in other ways. And so first and foremost, those individuals that you're looking to have be your customers, they're drawn to you in this overcrowded market of too many products and services and technology. They're drawn to you when there's a compelling story. So we want to talk a little bit about how we tell that story. We won't spend too much time on this, but Simon Sinek, who has written Start With Why and Leaders Eat Last and has lectured on TED Talks on many occasions, has an excellent book on this. I think it's important for every company, especially as you start out and go to market, to understand what your why is and why you do what you do before you try to define to the market how you do it and what you're actually doing. And when you start with why, everything else tends to fall into place. And that passion that you have as a founder and as a principal pushing things along comes through and shines out, and people are attracted to that. And that really becomes kind of the basis and crux of the story you tell. As we talk about a brand and the elements of a brand is not a logo. A brand is not a pithy statement and a tagline. A brand is an emotional connection that you make with another human being or they make with your product or service. And so it's important that as we talk about branding, what composes a brand is first and foremost that story and message, what makes you unique. The visual elements, photography, layout, etc., the personality, as well as your actual product and service, all of that together is what we call a brand, which, at the end of the day, it's how you emotionally connect with that individual your product does. So as we think about, as we then think about what does this mean, it's important as you look ahead to think about today versus the future, you have to think, who are we today and where is it we want to go 3 to 5 years out, not just with revenue, but with our brand. What market position do we want to have and what do we want to own? And so as you evaluate the gap between where you are today and versus where you want to be and the amount of customers and type of customers that you have, we call that brand positioning. And that brand positioning, those statements allow you to progress and see that natural progression from current today with a handful of customers to 3 to 5 years out, very successful with hundreds of, if not thousands. And so that's an important step for you to kind of map that. That's something we work with a lot of the companies that approach us is, let's first define where we're going.
and then we'll talk about some of the steps of what it's going to require. As we then talk through, so I thought this would be kind of fun. This is just some examples of, as we talk about telling a story, I thought it'd be fun, to try to emotionally connect with each of you on the webinar today. If you've ever had a Creamy before, you know it's a delicious, ice cream snack, and one that you can buy all over the country. We've done some work with them, but the guy who said you can't buy happiness must have been talking about cabbage. So as you look at that and you kind of smile and think, yeah, I can relate to that, when I was a kid. Or this here, this is to, this was for the Radisson Hotel in the Salt Lake area, and they have a burger that is a pound of meat with, if you open it up, there's cheese and sauce stuffed inside as well. And it's amazing. They call it the Canyon Challenge, and I love this. Eating this will leave you with the same sentiments of those who just finished their first marathon. Pride, satisfaction, the overwhelming feeling that you might throw up. And so these types of statements, people look at that and they kind of smile and there's some humor, but then they, maybe they feel challenged and it connects with them. I'll just go through a couple of others just here briefly. This here is for a recreational outdoor products company that we've worked with, sold in REI. And you can see that there's a slight product here on the left, but if you look at this picture, and the line here is, you wanted somewhere with an outdoor pool, wish granted. And then this next one that follows up on that campaign, you look at this and think, wow, how cool would that be to find that place? And, the payoff is stay in a 5,000-star hotel. And so you look at these and, you begin to think, wow, that's what it means to tell a story. That's what it means to have the narrative that attracts people. And not that you have to do it in the form of an ad, but that's the emotion that we're trying to convey.
So Phil, can I ask you a question about brand as it relates to Madra?
Yeah.
Maybe some free advice. What you've seen a little bit of what Madra has and what they're offering. What as far as creating the emotional connection, what could you speak to on that?
I think what's important, especially with Madra or any type of software company, is you kind of have to create emotion in two levels, both to those that you sell into, on a broader level, and get their organizational institution support as well as the student. Students got to come in, and for them it's, here's a tool that I've been given, and it just needs to feel easy. It needs to be intuitive.
I can tell you that's hard to do when they're taking an exam.
It is. But no, it absolutely is, and eventually over time you figure out how to do that better and better. That you just have this great user experience, and not that you can control their emotions, but you can at least just make it simple. You can make it so as they're learning, and the software platform, the play that you're providing behind the scenes is just naturally helping them get to the next step. But more importantly, so there's a story to tell there. But the bigger story is how you pitch, present, sell, Madra into, institutions and kind of from a higher buying level. And I think what's important is at this point, you can tell the story of why Madra came about. But I think the story to probably tell is the successes you've seen, that as you progress over time, that you can tell the story of, here's a typical university or institution or, educational, and this is what their experience was. And here's what the frustrations they have with the old way of doing things, and enter Madra, and we were able to, and so the focus isn't so much on Madra, on you and the software. The focus is how you were able to transform that testing, learning, and adapt that experience for the students. And I think if you tell the story in that context, that in that hero's journey, you're not the hero as Madra. The hero's them, the institution, the individual making the decision to buy and implement this out, throughout their organizations. But you're there as the trusted advisor. You're there as the individual that's gone before, has tested and proven this, and you're saying, look at the future we could have together in a better experience. I think that's the story you want to tell, and you do it kind of in their eyes, in their context, from their vantage point.
Question I have on that, just following up on that. So I think of companies that have pushed their brand throughout the company, the culture, you just see it. So you read a Groupon description of a product, and you can picture the person who wrote that. You know what's going on in that company. How can a company like Madra or another startup in that stage
start that process of building that culture with their customers? I mean, I don't know if I should think that a test should have the same type of copy as a Groupon ad, but I mean, if I'm taking a test and I see a little bit of that culture of the company come out, that may do it. But how do you start that vision of pushing that brand and that culture throughout a company?
It's interesting. I was reading an article the other day, and I think it made a good point. They said culture just doesn't happen. It's not a melding pot of everyone that works there. It's not just every team member that joins changes the culture. Culture is a decision, and it's from the top down, and you have to make the choice as a founder to say, what type of culture are we defining? The first day Salesforce, wrote up their articles and, became a real company. They simultaneously created a nonprofit entity and committed that they would devote X percentage of revenue every year to support what they were passionate about and what their employees cared about. And that
just bought the largest building in San Francisco, right? That nonprofit should be happy too, I hope.
and that's kind of the point. I mean, from day one, they said, we're going to do something great here. Now, granted, Mark Benioff, it wasn't his first rodeo, but he intentionally went in and defined brand and culture and saw them as somewhat similar. Now, what I would say is when you think about the experience you're trying to give as a brand, anytime, whether it's through email or web or in person or through the software itself that somebody has with Madra, you want to think about, okay, how will they feel? What are the practical and emotional benefits they'll glean from using our software? So you think about that experience, but then you have to translate that to your internal company and culture, and you have to think about, how does this look employee-wise? Because if you don't, you're not authentic. You're trying to be something, but it's not aligning with internal. And I promise that by the time they talk to and meet real humans, that are associated with Madra, and if it's out of whack and out of balance, and if they don't feel like what you're saying aligns with, what you're trying to, portray yourself as, I think they can sense that. As a quick example, you look at Ken Garff and their billboards, and we all get annoyed along I-15 by seeing them, but those billboards are more for their employees than they are for us. And they're reminding their sales team, and that's in sincerity. We've known them from the ground up as they've launched that campaign. If the sales team isn't bought into it, and they did so much training, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to get the sales team to listen first, and if they're not continually reminded, then you keep hearing, we hear you walk into a Ken Garff dealership, and the second they're not listening, you say this is just a farce and leave. And so you got to have that consistency. So hopefully that kind of answers some of those questions. I'm going to keep moving a little bit for time's sake. I want to wrap up here in the next couple of minutes. We'll just lightly touch on this as we start to think about the marketing technology roadmap, and you'll have these slides, so I won't go into all of them, but one thing that we've tried to kind of show at Fluid is that you don't have to embrace and do everything at once. Of course, you should start with a website, but then as you get into it, do you need a full-blown marketing automation platform? As you're still trying to grapple with first customers? Probably not. But it's good to get an email service provider in like a MailChimp. Do you need expensive web analytics to begin with? Probably not. Google Analytics will do. And so it's to say, where do you need to start? And with technology, what's kind of the minimum? And then where do we progress into? In terms of the technology, the go-to-market, how do we measure results? How do we test for conversion, et cetera? And we'll talk a little bit more about this. One of those things that we've talked about is automation. So this is something as you begin to gain your first customer set, and we'll spend a little bit more time on this in the next webinar, but it really is the brainchild. It's what's behind the scenes without having per se to staff up with 3 or 4 additional team members. Marketing automation can actually do that. A lot of those mundane tasks that are repetitive, and it can map what the CRM is holding from a brain perspective and all that data, and it can translate that into actionable insight and actually work on your behalf via email campaigns and collecting data and providing, who the individuals are and customers that you ought to work with. Now, when you're talking about going from product to customer, when you're only dealing with a couple of customers, I imagine you want to work with them each pretty closely, and you probably don't need a full-blown solution yet, but it's worth considering. It's worth to get it on the roadmap, and that's the point. You eventually need to get here. Any company that begins today, especially in software and beyond, if you don't have an automation solution after a couple of years, you're going to fail in some way. because it's a must-have now. A few of the things we'll touch on is just fundamental marketing processes. We talked a little bit about branding, a little bit about that strategy. Of course, you're familiar with the SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and seeing kind of in the marketplace how you're positioned, where others are, and what you have unique and how you leverage that in terms of a core competency. Getting down to keyword planning, so it's to say, well, what are people searching for on Google? What is important? What is the market responding to? And there's often a lot of cues that happen online that can help you offline in sales presentations, that you can actually see what some of those concerns are in longer tail key terms. And then that, of course, from a campaign strategy, when you are doing paid efforts in terms of acquiring new customers, building that out, audience segmentation, it's not enough to say, we only have a single audience, and that hardly is ever true. You probably have a few audiences that even early on you can begin to segment, and whether that's a more enterprise mid-market to SMB, whether that's an age demographic difference, or how various use cases are for the software. So it's important to think through that. You think about your content roadmap and asset development and what needs to happen over time, and then as well as campaign execution. As you then think about, okay, we've done these other necessary processes and steps in the marketing process, but once you deploy, you're hardly ever done. That's usually step one. And the learning on your first campaign or two is just remarkable. I mean, it's fire hose-like, where you're just having water flood in, and you're just trying to keep up. And if you're not continually pivoting and learning and changing how you're allocating dollars spent and optimizing the campaign, you're missing something. And so there's even a process in how you execute campaigns. I won't go into all of this today. Happy to answer questions and talk with individuals on the webinar offline on this. But there is just a myriad of digital and web and analytic tools that a lot of these are free, some aren't. What's important is when you launch your site, when you launch your software, if you're not immediately learning and looking through analytics and conversion analysis and user-recorded sessions and looking at what Google can provide and social media insights, you're going to miss something. And so in today's world, you want to talk to real customers and get real feedback, but there's so much qualitative and quantitative data available on your actual product and your actual website that you shouldn't miss. I mean, this is going to keep you in a competitive advantage and an edge that if you already went to market sooner than others, if you're paying attention to this, you can continue to stay ahead and pivot and iterate and become, at least know what the product roadmap would be. And then lastly, I'll just touch on this as we think about buyer personas and heat mapping, or the buyer personas and buyer journeys, we think about how do we tell the story of an individual we're trying to reach. How old are they? What are their interests? What are their goals? How do they make decisions? What keywords and pay points, do they respond to? And even doing a little bit of some write-up and behavior trends. And so often you can go out and there's a lot of great tools out there and templates by which it shows you how to build a buyer persona. But then, before you go to market, it's important to go get, gather and layer on some third-party data. That might be Gartner or Forrester and others, and just get to know your customer a little bit. And then as you have done that, that then kind of dovetails as you think about the sales funnel and progressing them along. This is what we call a buyer's journey. So what is the customer doing, thinking, feeling, and experiencing along each step of the way as they investigate, as they discover, as they consider, and then make a decision to buy and beyond. And so it's important that as you grow up, so to speak, over time from first customer to even more customers, you're learning and you're figuring out what people are responding to, and then you're able to build a content map and journey in the future to know, okay, next, as we are able to scale this, what does this look like along each step of the way, and making sure that you have both interactive tools and resources and presentations and content along those lines. So a lot of probably too much, and I apologize for going a little quickly, but a lot of great tools here that we're happy to provide to this audience as well, that you can probably do some research and find online. But as we think about your first customers, you got to define who they are. You then learn, and then you pivot and you redefine who they are, and then map the appropriate content map the brand and the story and, how you're going to connect with them emotionally. And again, from a marketing plan development and beyond, other good tools that you can access. Dustin, anything you want to add along these lines?
No, I think you've mostly touched on it. I definitely think that there are a lot of initial stages that you want to, and I did want to come back to, we talked about SWOT, and we previously talked about it in the last webinar. I just feel like it's something that people write down and then they file away somewhere, and they never really look at it. And as we talked about culture, how does that actually permeate into your culture if you're not really paying attention to it, if you're not really understanding who your competitors are, who your different segments are, things of that nature. And so I look at that document as a true roadmap for the rest of your business and something you should be coming back to after your first quarter, after your first year, over and over, and see if your company hasn't changed due to market conditions or insights from consumers, or if you are still on the same path and you just need to make sure that that kind of sentiment is still being perpetuated within your organization.
And one thing we'll do for our next webinar, there was a lot that we went through today, but we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into a lot of these in terms of, now that you've built the foundation, what are some of the steps to begin to grow and then accelerate that growth? And we'll talk through how to revisit some of these processes and, kind of build on where you began and, take these learnings and group them together and, collect some key insights.
So here's a question, Phil, from more of the founder's perspective. I feel like working in a startup is like, it's like a fire hose, drinking from a fire hose in a lot of ways, but I feel like I'm constantly, as a founder, trying to juggle priorities. And I recognize, most of what you've gone through is stuff that's crossed my mind that I need to do at some point within my company. But I also have explored some of that and found that, and it's a balancing act sometimes to decide when to hand that off to someone else and when someone on my founding team needs to still be involved in that, because we just don't know yet as a company what the right decisions are there, and it's very difficult without having your finger on the pulse to gauge where that's going. So, in more general sense, what are your recommendations as a founder? How do I decide when it's time to hand some of that off, and when do I need to keep it in-house? And what are some criteria for making that decision?
Well, and I'll answer it this way too. I am such a believer in sales before marketing. It's good to market and it's good to have a story, but it does take time. Sometimes you're just kind of fudging it and making it up as you go and trying to get it right, and eventually kind of polish that a little bit. But before I would hire a marketing person, I hired a sales guy. And so as a founder, it's to say, well, I have somebody selling for me. Not that you have to hire somebody to do that, but as you begin to scale, think about, well, what's going to grow my business and gain first set of customers. But then you get to the point that you say, okay, we can't just keep going out to do one-offs. And where marketing comes in is allows you to look appropriately in the market to say, how do we support the sales team, but then ultimately how do we create awareness and brand and positioning and market share and kind of get beyond that and get a little bit more sophisticated. I like to think that, it's like, the sales comes first as, the brother that's kind of anxious and, starts running and, is making efforts and strides and progress. But then the smart sister comes along, which is marketing, that kind of helps architect and mastermind what the future is going to hold as well. So when you get to the point of starting to have serious conversations, especially as it relates to the brand story, the website, we usually find most companies will get, that first iteration up of their marketing logo and some of their sales collateral. We do have some freelancers do it, but then they kind of get to the point to say, okay, it's time to grow up. How do we move from, toddler to adolescence and, to adulthood with our materials and how we message? And that's the point, usually, to engage an agency, when it makes more sense, where you're beginning to say, okay, I almost can justify hiring a marketing person. And at that point, that's usually when you want to start talking to an agency as well. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Makes sense, yep.
I think we might do a little bit of some Q&A here in a moment. With Facebook Live, we have some questions that have come in and want to go there. But real quick, in summary, number one, we need to know why people are buying your product. And so asking them, directly, as well as using the data that we talked about, and what value they're really gleaning, learning from your customers daily, the upsell opportunities and making it easy to buy. There's a lot of ways to do that, and that's part of the purpose. A lot of these digital tools is just to allow that friction in the sales process to be lessened. Dustin, we'll turn it over to you again.
Yeah, so if you guys want to just give us 1 second, anybody on, if you'd like to jump over to Facebook, we'll be going live here in just a moment. In the meantime, we do have some resources that were mentioned throughout the webinar. If you guys would like, those are something we think would be really valuable for you on your journey. We'll be sending out links for those in the recap as well, but take note of the slide for any of the books or other resources that you can pick up. Real quick, just give us 1 second. We'll be right back, and we'll be live on Facebook.
Okay, we're ready. We have a couple of questions that Dustin's going to ask that.
So I'll just shoot you guys some questions that came in. And then just speak loudly because our mic is a little bit further this way. And actually, the first question is for Bryce. There's a cost to getting the product from idea to development. There's a cost to take a product to market. What percentage do you put into development versus distribution?
That is a great question. I think it really depends on the industry and depends on the market. So that's probably a difficult question to answer without having some more context. Let me try and speak to what we did with Mandra. I would say that probably 80% of what's happened over the last 2 years has been focused on product development. That said, we started very early with some initial customers, and so a lot of the feedback that we were able to get, and then by talking to other potential customers, has come from them. In the absence of that, I think you really need to focus more on not marketing per se, but on talking to the market. So you're not necessarily trying to sell them yet, but you need to figure out what problems they have and what need to be solved. Because if you build a product that doesn't fit that, it's wasted money. It's wasted resources. So I think until you can definitively answer, here's a problem or a set of problems that we know a large group of people with money needs solved, then you need to focus on resources in that arena before you build product.
Great idea. The next question I think is for the general panel. Question is, what happens if you start with one unique proposition and go to market? How hard is it to pivot after you learn from the market?
It's harder not to pivot because you end up failing eventually.
And I think you just have to have the mindset to know that you will pivot, and so be prepared for that. Don't have everything emblazoned on every logo, billboard, building. I think you just want to be careful to know that we're going to adapt and change, and just be flexible and be prepared to be able to do that.
And I think as you get feedback from the market, that's helping to legitimize your product offering. And so if you're giving them more of what they want, then that's a good thing.
It's kind of a question for Madras and TVC. How did Madras contact TVC, and how did you come to build a contract?
So initially, my business partner and I, my co-founder, we engaged with the TVC just in an investigative manner. We came in and knew that there were good technologies that came out of the university, and really just started to investigate those. That's how it started. We have a very lengthy background in technology, particularly in software, and so we kind of started engaging on some smaller projects with them, helping meet some software needs at the TVC. That's actually where Mandra, where we were introduced to the project. So we started in that role, and then very quickly recognized that there was some great potential for it to be a company and a product. So.
At TVC, we're constantly looking for talented people to come in and help take technologies to market, and so that's where we spend a lot of time, is trying to identify those people who are willing to come in and help get a new technology out to market. And so that's where we were able to
work with Bryce and his partner to say, hey, here's a new technology, and they found an interest, chemistry worked, and so chemistry.
Yeah. I'll throw out there too, I've worked with 3 or 4, that was cool. I like that.
Yeah.
We've worked with 3 or 4 other venture commercialization offices, and I will say that the University of Utah by and far has been the best to work with, not just from a person standpoint, but they have kind of grasped onto this idea that technologies are going to be more successful if they can get them closer to commercialization before they license them. And so I've found that what they offer is a process and technologies that are more, frankly much better than what I've found elsewhere.
Stop it. Stop it.
And plus, they invited you on the webinar today.
Right.
You gotta say that.
And actually, that's a good segue into our next question. The question is, I started my company and now I have a few customers that keep me sustainable. I get a lot of my new clients from referrals. How important is it to have a marketing component when I have a referral-based industry? And I would say you kind of soundly gave TVC a referral. Maybe you guys can talk to when is it ready to, maybe go more outward into the market than just might be network.
I'd say that's a good sign that you'll have success if you go to market. If people are referring you, then probably means you have something that's a good product. So you'll probably find some good fruits.
Yeah, I would say make an assessment as to your scalability of both the model and your infrastructure. If you're based on referral and you have your self-sustaining, that's fantastic. Sometimes if you want to grow, you have to change your model or you have to change something that you're doing in your business to be able to say, okay, I'm ready for 1,000 customers rather than 100 or 50, because I can manage those. And that's, the TVC has done that over the last few years. We've had to change our process to get systems and processes in place that will allow us to do more volume of that value creation. I would say that's the same for any company. Make sure that you can create the value that you want as a standard before you start saying, I want to 10 times my customer base. I don't know, are there other?
I would agree with that.
The next question is for Madras, but I think the whole panel can answer. We are looking at creating a website and building sales collaterals. What assets have you found most useful for moving your product into the market?
Definitely a website. There's, the digital world is by and far, I would say, the most cost effective. So definitely a website. Even if you go outside the digital world, like maybe you're visiting some conferences or you're talking to some groups, they're going to want to come and visit your website, and it just adds legitimacy. So I would say that's the first thing you should focus on until you have that. And then the rest, I think, depends on the market and who you're trying to reach.
One of the best ways to know what you should be creating first is after your website's launched, go talk to whoever's selling your product and say, what is it you need to be successful? And usually that's a pitch deck, usually that's a one-pager. I mean, there's a couple of things you just need to have out of the gate, and they're often the best judge of what those are and what type of content you should have on.
I think one last question, and this is more generated for the TVC, but the question is just how many clients have you helped, and are there industries you work with better than others?
So we get about 250 new inventions a year that are disclosed to our office that we have to take through that vetting and validation and development process that we run. So as we take that down the funnel, we will start up about somewhere between 10 and 20 companies per year. We've been doing that for about the last 10 years. And then we'll license technologies to established companies like a GE or a Conoco or whoever it is. We do that about 40 to 60 times per year. So that's kind of our pipeline. And now I've forgotten the second part of the question.
What industries?
Oh, right, industries. So about 50% of our technologies are in the healthcare space. About 30 to 40 are in the engineering and software space. The remaining is broad across every department on campus. So you think about a university, what do they teach, what are the departments? We touch 95% of those departments, and we get disclosures from those. So we have to be very broad. It forces us to be a mile wide and an inch deep. So we look for partners and people who know an industry very deep, and we'll partner with them. So that's kind of our model. Are there additions, Spencer, that you would suggest?
The only thing I would add to that is that, and Madra fits into this, where, if you have a life science technology, it can take a long time to get a product to market. And so a lot of what we've talked about today in the last webinar, it's a little bit different in healthcare. When there's regulatory issues you have to consider, software is fun to work on because you can get something out there pretty quickly that people can test, and there isn't someone saying, that's going to harm someone else, so you can't use that.
We do find that a lot of our technologies have a component that is software, whether it's in the healthcare space and it's a piece of software that has to run on an MRI machine, or coming from the chemistry department where they need software to build out a curriculum or whatever it is. So that's the nice thing about what Spencer does in our software development center is it runs along almost every one of our technologies has a software component where whether it's a website or whether it's kind of deeper software development that needs to be done, that's a lot of what our office deals with, and that's a lot of what Spencer in the software development center handles.
Fantastic, guys. I think that's all the time we have for today's Q&A. Appreciate you all being here. From the campus, the University of Utah campus, of the Technology and Venture Capitalization offices, we want to let you know we will be back in 1 month with the 4th part in our series, and we'll be going live again then. If you have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to contact us on Twitter or any of our social media channels, or directly on our website as well. We will be sending the recap of this webinar in the next week or so. And until next time, thanks again, guys, and we'll talk to you soon.